Welcome to Search for Signs. My name is Gary Willing. If this information interests you, please press the like and subscribe button and press the bell for notifications. Now, if you listen to Benjamin Creme's lectures online, right, at some point in there, he's going to use the word overshadowing. Now, he didn't always explain and go back and explain what that meant. Sometimes he did, but he talked about it and spoke about overshadowing so casually that I think that oftentimes he, like I said, he didn't go back and explain what it is. And I know for myself, I've gone back and listened to my videos, and I talk about this master working through that disciple, like Maitreya worked through Jesus in Palestine. The master DK worked through Alice Bailey and wrote those books and stuff like that. And that's how they did it, was through the process of overshadowing. But the only way to really explain overshadowing, I got to go back and talk a little bit about the history of the masters, because the masters were not always hidden away. There was a time hundreds of thousands of years ago that the masters were known for who they were, just like they're about to be now, but they worked openly and guided humanity at whatever level we were at. And what happened is there was a great war in Atlantean times, and it was depicted in the Bible as the Great Flood. But the continent of Atlantis was destroyed, and the Masters of Wisdom, who Maitreya is the head and leader of that group, he wasn't back then, but he is now, they went in retreated into their retreats, right? And then the forces of darkness, or the masters who head that group, went into their retreats. So they both, as I guess it was more like a stalemate, and they both had to kind of leave from interacting with humanity directly. And so for 100,000 years or so, the masters have lived in what we would refer to as isolation. But the masters are omniscient. They are telepathic. They weren't living in isolation. So they weren't going crazy and stir crazy, living in these, living up in the woods, right? But they lived so far away from the average humanity that humanity wouldn't just bump into them. So, Maitreya lived 17,500 feet up. So how many people are going to go walking by there? It's not very convenient, And he did that because, they wanted to be left alone, I guess, right? But they also didn't want people to know where they were. But they didn't just stop working and take a break for 100,000 years. They've been working, but they had been working through their disciples telepathically in the world. And so one way that they would do it is, for instance, they would maybe inspire a disciple to do something, whether that was whatever the line of work that disciple was interested in or could be interested in. They might implant a little idea, a little thought, a little inspiration for them to do that. That's one way, right? The other way that they would do it, it's a little more advanced, is a master could be living in their retreat, and they have an idea for an invention, like the light bulb or the phone is a good example, right? And they have all the plans of how it would work and all that kind of stuff, and they put that thought, it was a thought form of the invention of the phone, out in what's called the mind belt. And then whoever is kind of trying to work on that idea can start to pick up on the idea of how to make the phone. That's really why Alexander Graham Bell, who's credited with inventing the phone, right? He put in the patent for the phone hours, I think. I don't even think it was a day. It might have been the day before or something. I don't know. It was just a few hours before somebody else came up with the same idea, and they almost looked exactly the same, because it was inspired by one of the masters to have that invention made at that time. But the average person walking on the street would not think to make a phone, because they weren't even sensitive enough to, they weren't thinking about the idea already. And then they weren't sensitive enough to that mental impression, which is what that is by the masters. And then a higher way that these masters work is they work more directly, telepathically with a disciple. They can overshadow a disciple, and a bit of the master's consciousness can actually enter into that disciple. So like looking at Jesus, right? Jesus, when he was in Palestine, was a disciple. He wasn't even a master at that point. He was very, very, very advanced disciple. Even for that time, he was but even today, he would be considered very advanced, right? But Maitreya's consciousness worked through him by overshadowing him in that way. So there was times when Maitreya was talking directly to the people. Jesus consciously would kind of step aside and let Maitreya work through him. Other times it was just Jesus talking, and other times it was both of them talking at the same time. So from a listener's point of view, if you were looking at Jesus, it would all kind of seem like it was the same person talking. But yet there were two different individuals working through that vehicle. But that was the service work that Jesus provided, was he allowed Maitreya to work through him in that way. Now, other disciples like Muhammad, right? Well, it was the same thing, but Jesus was the master then, working through Muhammad. So Jesus actually wrote the Quran through Muhammad. So a lot of the truths that Jesus wanted, in the Bible or in the Quran, for instance, right? Other artists, right, like Bach, Mozart, Rembrandt, they were all overshadowed by a master, whether it was Maitreya or somebody else. I know Benjamin Creme mentioned that Rembrandt painted like over 80 self-portraits. He's like the first selfie person to do a selfie, but it was a painting, right? Take a lot longer than just sticking up an iPhone out there and then taking a picture, right? I don't know how long it took him to make a painting, but anyway, you know what I mean. But it's a very simple painting. He's just kind of sitting there. Sometimes he put some ornate kind of outfit and garb on, but for the most part, it was very simple and very quiet, and he's just kind of serene looking and he's painting, right? But according to Benjamin Creme, Maitreya overshadowed him when he painted. So when he was looking in the mirror and he was painting, it was actually, he was painting Maitreya's eyes into the painting. So if you see if you have seen one of Rembrandt's self-portraits, that's who is painting. And it was one of the works that Rembrandt did was to introduce people to Maitreya, but he did it in his own way, very simply as a painter. Very simple, right? But yet it energetically, that started the whole process of making known the presence of Maitreya. Other disciples like Alice Bailey, right? Well, her master, or not her master, but the master Djwal Khul, who wasn't her master, but telepathically wrote all the books through the Lucius Trust publications. He wrote it through the process of telepathy. So I know Benjamin Creme, talked about how Jesus had to forge that relationship to create, and it took him years to do it, to create the ability to be overshadowed by Maitreya. Benjamin Creme said it took him decades, I think, and he had to work upwards of 15, 20 hours a day, 7 days a week for decades just to get the ability to be able to work telepathically with his master. It didn't come naturally to him. And that's why when I scroll through YouTube and I see all these, the Lord Maitreya gave a message, I was like, oh God, because I'd be willing to bet you that none of these people put any effort into it, right? They just rolled out of bed one day and like, wow, I got a message from Maitreya. Oh, there's another one. There's another one. Oh my gosh, this is incredible. I love it, right? And it's all made up in their mind because the masters, it takes a long time and a long effort because we're pretty thick, and dense as people. And that's why, it takes even an advanced disciple like Benjamin Creme or Jesus years to get to that kind of relationship where they can actually have the ability to be overshadowed by one of the masters. Now, in the not so distant future, everyone above the age of 14 will have the experience of overshadowing because Maitreya is going to overshadow the whole world, and every man, woman, and but every man and woman above the age of 14 will hear Maitreya's message inwardly in their own language. So somebody like my wife who's from the Philippines but speaks English, she's going to probably hear it in Ilongo, I guess. I'll hear it in American. And I always say that because it cracks me up, right? If you're from France, you'll hear it in French, and, if you're, I don't know, from China, you hear it in Chinese, right, or whatever, so forth and so forth, right? And so that there's no misinterpretation of what Maitreya is saying, but his call to humanity, his, you know, his loving words that he's going to explain where we've come from, how far we've fallen, to how we can get out of it if we just work together, to where we could possibly go, is all going to be done through the process of overshadowing. So when we see him on TV, his mouth is not going to move. It's just we're going to hear it telepathically in his head, in our head. So when we replay it, it's just going to be silent. It's going to be kind of incredible, but we'll know what it's like to be overshadowed at that point. But according to Benjamin Creme's master, that's the only time it's ever happened, and it's the only time it will ever happen. But it's global Pentecost is what it is. That scene in the Bible of Pentecost where everybody heard God in their own language, you know, in that little group. But it's going to be done on the world stage. So anyway, that's what the process of overshadowing is from my little perspective. But these masters, that's how they've been working through it. Now, will they continue to do it into the future? I'm sure, right? But they're also going to be teaching us directly. So we'll be able to see Maitreya on TV, hear his words directly on TV. We won't have to hear it through a disciple. We can actually see what he's saying. You know, same thing with all these other masters working in whatever field of endeavor they're working in, from the sharing of the world's resources and the UN to the beautification of the cities. We can get their advice directly, you know, if we're working in those fields or so forth. The teachings of the master who was Paul, and the master who was John, and the master who was Peter, you know, we'll be able to experience their wisdom directly, right? We won't have to have an intermediary like Alice Bailey or Helena Blavatsky or even Benjamin Creme. We can actually see what they're saying. But I'm sure that the process of overshadowing will go on, where disciples that once they get to a certain level will be able to be overshadowed by a master for a certain length of time, so that their work can go on that way or something. But anyway, I just wanted to share that. And as always, take action. Help SOP save our planet. Thanks for listening, and we look forward to talking to you again in future videos. Have a great day.